Welcome back. Good Tuesday morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Maria Bartiromo, and it is Tuesday, December 3rd. Your top stories right now, 6:33 a.m. on the East Coast. A Fox Business alert this morning. We've got fresh trade fears turning markets negative. Futures completely reversing course this morning after President Trump, in a press conference in London, said that he has no deadline on a China trade deal, and he may even wait until after the 2020 election to ink a deal. This as he's preparing for a packed first day of the NATO summit in London this morning. He's expected to meet with a handful of world leaders on pressing issues like trade and foreign threats. All of that detail coming up this morning. Our top story this half an hour, President Trump pressing his vision for NATO in London. Earlier this morning, the president held a news conference with the NATO Secretary General, and he cited efforts to increase defense spending among member nations of NATO, even calling out one country for its recent remarks disparaging the alliance.
Nobody needs NATO more than France. And frankly, the one that benefits really the least is the United States. We benefit the least. We're helping Europe. Europe unites and they go against a common foe. That may or may not be a foe. Can't tell you that. But there are other foes out there also. But I think nobody needs it more than France. And that's why I think that when France makes a statement like they made about NATO, it's a very dangerous statement for them to make. When I came in, I was angry at NATO. And now I've raised $130 billion. And by the way, you're talking annually. You know, you're talking about a tremendous amount of money. You're talking about numbers that are astronomical. And yet, you still have many delinquent, I call them delinquent when they're not paid up in full.
Joining me right now to talk more about that is Fox News Senior Strategic Analyst, General Jack Keane. General, always a pleasure to see you. Thanks so much for being here.
Glad to be here, Maria.
You know, it's interesting to hear the president talk about France the way that he did just like an hour before he's going to be sitting down with Emmanuel Macron to talk through some issues like trade and foreign threats. What was your reaction to what the president just said there about NATO and, in particular, France?
Well, first of all, it's the 70th anniversary of NATO, so it's not surprising that NATO members are fawning over themselves a little bit, and rightfully so. I mean, this is the most powerful political and military alliance that's ever been established. It certainly stood up against the Soviet Union threat, and it was one of the enablers that, that led to its collapse and its defeat. But despite that, there's a lot of differences and divisions inside of NATO, not the least of which is what has occurred recently with President Macron making the statement that NATO was brain dead and criticizing it very severely. I think, frankly, Macron has so many problems domestically that I think he was trying to shift some of the focus to foreign policy and national security, and also elevate himself to a status replacing Angela Merkel as the de facto leader of the European Union, and accentuate that status, to his domestic audience. But
wow.
I think he's dead wrong about that. I mean, I have my issues with NATO. Listen, 9 NATO countries have been attacked by ISIS multiple times, not the least of which we've just seen again in London, either directed or inspired attacks. And NATO, a long time ago, should have declared war on ISIS. And that would lead to considerably more intelligence sharing. It would have been a lot more burden sharing inside of Syria, helping the Syrian Democratic Forces. There were 3 NATO countries there, United States, UK, and France. There could have been more there propping that situation up and helping to maintain vigilance inside of NATO. And so they clearly have their issues, and not the least of which is with Turkey, who's buying Russian missile defense systems.
Yeah. I want to ask about China, but before I do, let's stay on this meeting that the president is at in London at NATO, because he also weighed in on the situation in Iran. Watch this.
Iran is killing perhaps thousands and thousands of people right now as we speak. That's why they cut off the internet. So they cut off the internet so people can't see what's going on. But thousands of people are being killed in Iran right now. And frankly, I don't know how you get in there. I don't know how you do your business, but the press ought to get in there and see what's going on. Because the word is that thousands of people are being killed in Iran.
And the government there is admitting it. Iranian state TV is now admitting that the regime has shot and killed protesters. General, your reaction to this?
Yeah, they started the day after the protests began using snipers from rooftops and just confronting them right on the streets. Amnesty International says 200+ dead. I think it's several hundred likely. Thousands wounded, and 8 to 10,000 in their jail cells. And if you're in their jail cells, you're being beaten and tortured on a regular basis. 150 to 170 cities and towns involved in this protest. This is cut across the entire social and economic fabric of Iran. Very different than the 2009 protest, which was about the urban educated class, and they were protesting an election fraud that they believe took place. This is clearly two reasons. One is the impact of the sanctions, but two, just the ineffective governance and corruption of the Iranian regime, even in just maintaining the services for their own people and trying to provide an effective government. That's what's come together here and causing all this frustration. Never seen before in the 40 years of the regime, this kind of frustration.
Really a sad situation there for the Iranian people. Then there's the Chinese people. Let me ask you about China's response to the U.S., because now China is barring, they say we're going to bar any U.S. Navy ships and aircraft from visiting Hong Kong and using their ports. This is in retaliation to the American bill supporting pro-democracy protesters, which, of course, the president has signed. The markets, I think, initially, when the president first signed this, were relieved that the response from China wasn't even worse, because this is not that big of a response. I mean, there are a ton of ports in Asia that the U.S. can use. They don't need Hong Kong, right?
Right. I mean, this is symbolic. This has happened before when there's been tension between China and the United States. Likely, the United States will be able to go back into Hong Kong again with their port of calls. The China's reaction to the president signing that piece of legislation, as you indicated, it was not as strong as some people thought it would be. I think China is still very much in the deal in terms of the tariffs and the trade deal that the United States and China are attempting to make. They may have been actually slow rolling that deal a little bit, hoping the president would not sign that legislation. But I think it was absolutely the right thing to do to stand up behind the Hong Kongers. As you know, Maria, we're in a clash of values with the Chinese Communist Party. Democratic free nations are involved in that. The United States in the lead, and the Hong Kongers. This is the front line of that battle.
Yeah,
and no doubt about it. They're fighting for the same values that we have.
Absolutely. So you think it was right that the president signed it, and your reaction to the way the Chinese reacted, not so. I mean, you know, they were threatening this massive retaliation.
And I think that's typical of the Chinese. I mean, there's a lot of rhetoric, and then the action usually isn't quite matching the rhetoric.
Okay.
And I think that's what's happening here. And I think both countries are still focused on a trade deal. I think there likely will be one because both of them need the relief of that trade deal, for sure.
General, it's great to see you this morning. Thanks so much.
Yeah, good talking to you, Maria.
General Jack Keane joining us there.